And the way it goes is after we've created the table, I attach to that table a function called create. And all of the create functions have the same signature. They take a reference to the layers object, which, if you remember, is a display group that contains references to all the different layers in our game, underlay, content, and overlay. It takes a reference to the table that contains the level definition. So data is the table that contains all of the entries for, I'm sorry, no, it contains, data is the reference for the current entry that we're building. And then pieces is all of the entries for the entire level. Now the reason I did that is most of the time I don't use pieces for anything. But on occasion, I might want to put a piece in the table, or I may want to look at the pieces in the table. So I need to have that. For example, whereas this builder creates an object, and it puts that object in the pieces table. And if you remember, the pieces table is only for platforms. It doesn't contain the coins. It doesn't contain the spikes. We use this table later in player, and player looks at all of the entries in the table. It finds the object in the table that is nearest, and it says that object is my gravity object. So I've made all of these create functions with the same signature so that there's no question of how to lay them out and how to call them. You call them all the same way, and you know this is what you're getting each time. So of course, if people are going to make changes to this game and later they need more information, just be sure that if you add an argument here for, like, I don't know, you make up some table of my settings. Well, go ahead and modify all of the builders and call them all the same way. You don't necessarily need to use this data, but because the builders are supposed to be sort of generic, you want to have the same signature for each of them. Once we get into the create function, it's very simple. All I do is I create a variable called a piece, and then I step through here and I look in common and say, are we using nice graphics, or are we in debug mode? How are we doing this? And in this case, I'm saying, are we using nice graphics, or are we just using our plain Jane circles and squares? So if you're confused, if people don't remember, let me bring up common, and I'll just change this so you can see what happens.
And this goes back to building in your playtesting.
Yeah, so this goes way back to episode 1 of our discussion on this. Let me undo my changes here. All right, so right now we're using nice graphics. But if I go into common and I find the nice graphics, here it is, I find this and I say false. Now we're no longer using nice graphics, and I reload the game, assuming that I haven't got this selected again. Then we get circles and squares, and that's pretty much it. Some of it still looks kind of nice. I mean, as we've gone along, some of these things don't have the debug features, but if you remember the first time we did this, we had very few game objects. We had basically the round, the square, and the player. But now all we got is circles.
Which makes me think that you could easily build in themes to the game.
Oh yeah,
and those could be in-app purchases.
Exactly, that's a great point. So right now, here's our generic builder. It takes 3 things. Well, what if you had themes? You could pass in a themes table and current theme, or you could have common contain a reference that says theme number 2.
Yeah.
And then you could just pass in the theme data, or it could be part of common.
And I almost said there that could be an in-app purchase, but then I'm thinking, a second thought, it would be better as a rewarded, whatever you call it, like a rewarded perk, right? Yeah. Watch a video and get a theme, get a different theme. So
watch a video, get a hat.
Yeah. Something. Yeah. It doesn't have to be an entire theme, right? It could be our pieces and parts. I know. I say that because, my 15-year-old plays console games, and he's as much into the strategy and the action as he is the pieces and parts of the clothing, and the pieces and parts of the gun, and the pieces and parts of the storyline. So being able to mix and match that and make it something that you could extend through your own gameplay would be pretty appetizing, I think, to most young people.
Yeah, I mean,
to use that term, most young people.
Not old people like or as you referred to me earlier, the old people. Thank you so
No,
much.
the whippersnappers.
Yeah, whippersnappers. Okay, so having decided if we're going to make it look nice or not look nice, we go through one of these two bits here. And it's real simple. What we do is if we're making it look nice, we create a new image direct. We use some specific texture out of our images folder. And then we use settings out of common. So in this case, block size is our standard for the sizes for all the platforms. So because we're making a circle, but we're using an image, we're going to make basically an image rect. So if you were to look at this, it's really a rectangle with some transparent bits, and then the circle. And it's going to be the width of a block and the height of a block. And then if you'll recall, when we parsed through these tables, they had what? They had the type, they had an X and a Y position, and a subtype. So we take that data X and Y and we position our object. So this builder function is getting called for every time we see one of, let me find one of these in our subtables, our list of things that are in the level. So for every one of these, this builder gets called. And for the time it gets called here, the X and the Y are going to be 480 and 400. It might be a little bit hard to read on the screen. So X and Y are set to 480, 400. Or if we were doing what I think of as the more ugly version, we would just make a circle, give it a radius of half the block size, because that makes sense. Change the stroke and the color. And because we specify the X and the Y in the call, we would do that right here, data X, data Y. So at this point, we've got the object. It's been placed in the right level. It's in the right position. Then we just need to do some other things. Most of this stuff here is sort of like bookkeeping. You could almost delete this and completely ignore it. I did this because I wanted to give you guys some more feedback. So this section here, if the debug flag is enabled.
I thought that was debug was in English. Oh, sorry.
No, debug English. No, debug enabled. I'm a big fan of short names. Oh, I keep selecting the same thing. I got to do that. So with debug enabled, we get all these little markers and feedback and stuff. We get the arrow that tells us this is the direction of gravity. We get the little lines that show us the tangential vectors to gravity. The distance from our player to this block and to this block, so we know that the distances are working. This one's been shaded green. It says that's our gravity source. No, now this one is our gravity source. So these are all those things from episode 1. That business is done here. So for our round character, this little bit right here is the label, which is these red numbers. So that's all that is. You could just as well delete that. And this is what, oh, I forgot. No, you can't really, I take it back. You shouldn't delete that because I'm using it elsewhere. Yeah. Okay.
I love those sounds.
So
you can never mind.
Okay. So the point is the meat so far is this part right here. We basically made a circle, or we made an image, and we placed it somewhere in our level. Of course, this game uses physics, so what do we do here? We require the physics library locally within this builder. I could just as well have put this at the top of the file, but at the time that I coded it, I was just typing along, and it was just as easy for me to do it in the builder. So there's going to be a very little performance difference, but if you did want the best performance, you would do this and then refer to it below. For people who are trying to catch me out on performance now. Because there will be somebody out there going, hey, Ed, that's like, you're wasting half a millisecond, dude, and you're going to do that 1,000 times? That could hurt me. But you got to remember that these levels get built once, in a couple of frames maybe, and the cost of a couple of frames, hopefully just 1 frame time. You don't go past that. But I can imagine for a very large level that you'd need to be super efficient, so you wouldn't take more than 33 milliseconds or whatever it is to build it all up, so you wouldn't have any hiccups.